Hey everybody, it's Monday, November 27th, 2023. Welcome to the NFL Fantasy Football Show presented by Subway. It's me, your man, MG Marcus Grant, joined by Michael F. Florio. We got specialists in the building. Give yourselves a round of applause. Ooh, that sounds like you guys are still working off some tryptophan over there right after the Thanksgiving weekend. Glad, though, of course, we are grateful for your help all the time putting this show on. We are thankful for you all out there who are engaging with us, whether it's audio, video, social media, or sometimes even in the flesh, in real life. Good Thanksgiving weekend for you, aside from your team losing?
I'm going to focus on the 40 fantasy points I got from Josh Allen in that game.
Go.
But besides that part of the weekend, yeah, it was a very good Thanksgiving weekend. Nice to not be here for a couple of days to recharge for the playoff push and all that. How about you? How was your Thanksgiving?
It was good. Got to spend some time with the family, eat lots of good food. I still have a lot of leftovers. That's my job for the next couple of days, is plowing through as much of that as I possibly can. And not having to be here when the building was evacuated in the middle of Red Zone on Sunday, which I'm sure for a lot of you had your Twitter timeline spinning a little bit, with Scott Hansen doing his best to bring you every single touchdown despite having to go outside for a few minutes, apparently. Anyway, we are inside, and we are going to give you a lot of fantasy goodness for the next little bit or so. We got the biggest takeaways from Week 12, top performers, some disappointments, good and bad fantasy playoff schedules, because that is right around the corner, and some waiver wire targets. But we will start, as we always do, with some fantasy headlines. And one that popped up at least on the West Coast as we were waking up this morning. The Panthers have dismissed their head coach, Frank Reich, not even through a full season. He doesn't even make it one full season as the head man in Carolina. The Panthers have only won one game this season. It has not been a very good year for them, Florio. I don't really know what to say about it, because this is a team that doesn't have a ton of talent. They haven't really given us much from a fantasy perspective. I don't know that a head coaching change, especially this late in the season, is going to make a big impact one way or another.
The only real impact I think it has is Adam Thielen was the only Panther that we could trust with any sort of confidence in fantasy. And he had been, before yesterday, where I know he gave you a dud, over 20 fantasy points per game when Frank Reich was calling plays, just 11 per game when he wasn't. So it might now be just like you cannot start any Carolina Panther in fantasy football land.
Yeah, pretty much might be that point in this point in the season. So obviously more will come of that when we get later on into the season and the offseason. But for now, Frank Reich is out of a job in Carolina. Staying in the NFC South, though, a little bit of injury news. Chris Olave had to leave the Saints, lost to Atlanta with a concussion. Rashid Shaheed was forced out of the game with a thigh injury. So the Saints are just seeing their pass catchers dropping like flies over the course of the game. Anybody left that is possibly on waivers that interests you in that New Orleans offense?
I mean, those two, we're very much hoping that they could be back as soon as possible. But outside of them, no other receiver had more than 3 targets yesterday. It was the tight ends getting more involved in Taysom Hill and Juwan Johnson. So maybe you could grab one of the Taysom's roster, but you could grab Juwan Johnson maybe as a tight end streamer this week. But yeah, like A.T. Perry maybe, but I don't really think so.
A.T. Perry is a deep league pull. I think I had him as a deep dive waiver wire pick on Fantasy Live last week, but this is, I mean, you're talking deep leagues at this point, and you're looking for a depth add. Hard to imagine there's going to be anybody really out there. Michael Thomas, I should have mentioned as well, is on injured reserve, so he's out for the next few weeks. Not that he was a big-time fantasy producer for you anyway. So very few options in New Orleans at the moment. We'll keep an eye on the status of both Olave and Shaheed as we get later into the week. Time to dig into some of the things we learned, though, from Week 12. Still one more game to be played. It's the Bears and the Vikings on Monday Night Football. But we have a whole lot of things that we learned, mostly focusing on Sunday. Of course, we had games going back to Thursday as well. But what is one of the big things you took out of what you saw this weekend?
Devin Singletary officially stole the job from Dameon Pierce. I know it was something that we were talking about on this pod and on other shows the last couple of weeks, like how well Devin Singletary had been playing with Dameon Pierce sideline, but it was like, we have to make sure that this happens once Pierce returns, and boy did it. 81% of the snaps went to Devin Singletary. Only 6 carries, but 32 routes, 7 targets. He went for 72 yards, had a long catch and run, and this was in a tough matchup. The Jaguars have allowed the fewest rushing yards to running backs this season in a game where they were playing catch-up. So to see him heavily used in the passing game, we know that he will get more groundwork when the game script is a little bit more favorable. I think Devin Singletary is someone you could start with confidence moving forward, and Dameon Pierce he has to hit your bench. That's solely what he is good for now.
So he's got to hit the bench, and again, this is another thing. In shallower leagues, you probably go to the waiver wire at this point. I mean, it was one thing, okay, Devin Singletary's getting all this work. We'll see what happens when Pierce comes back. I think it was the snaps 49-11, I believe, something like that yesterday. I mean, it was all Devin Singletary, and he's starting to run more routes. He had 7 targets. It looks like it might be a wrap for Dameon Pierce, and that's one that I will take the L on because I was big on him this year. In Cincinnati, we were wondering how it might work with the pass catchers and Jake Browning at quarterback, and right now it looks like it might be Jamar Chase and really nobody else. Chase had a team-high 4 catches for 81 yards, and the thing about it is, of those 4 catches, a couple of them came on tipped passes, so even that wasn't easy for Jamar Chase in this one. I mean, everything was contested. It was hard to get a lot of good targets from this offense. Look, maybe it will get better for Jake Browning, but I can't imagine he's going to be able to sustain multiple pass catchers. It was a little bit of what you suspected, too, that they may lean on Joe Mixon. He had a decent game, had a lot of touches. I can't trust Tyler Boyd. We'll see what happens when T. Higgins is back. But it's just hard to think that this passing offense is going to go much deeper than Jamar Chase right now.
Yeah, and I mean, Mixon and Chase were the only Bengals with over 30 yards yesterday, and even Mixon had it was one long catch and run. It was brutal overall for this. Bengals offense goes from being one of the very best in the league with Joe Burrow to almost unusable for fantasy without him.
Yeah, it's been a rough year for the folks in Cincinnati. Speaking of wide receivers, you have worries about one a little bit closer to where we are.
Yeah, right across the way, Cooper Kupp there. His first 2 games back, 118 yards, 148 yards. In his last 5 games combined, 127 yards. Just 12 catches in those 5 games. I don't think it's a Cooper Kupp issue. Yes, I think it's fair to assume that he is not 100% healthy. We saw him exit the game a couple weeks ago. He's been dealing with this ankle issue, but he's one of the higher uncatchable target rates in the league this year. Matthew Stafford just has not been what he has been in the past. And even like yesterday on a big Matthew Stafford game, it's all going through Kyren Williams. And that is what scares me, that the Rams offense looks its best when it's running through Kyren Williams this year. So that could mean it's time to worry about Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp moving forward in fan. Great schedule the rest of the way. I think there's still guys that you start, but yeah, they're not the wide receiver ones that they were early in the year.
No, and it's been a really frustrating year for Matthew Stafford too. It just doesn't seem to be. Like you said, you had a good game yesterday. Before that, it hasn't really come together for him. Last thing. Do the Steelers have a functional offense now? It's weird. They get rid of Matt Canada, and you kind of wondered, okay, well, what's going to change? Well, what changed, they didn't score a lot of points, but they moved the ball. Over 400 yards of offense for the first time since week 2 of 2020. It had been a string of 58 games in a row with fewer than 400 yards of total offense. They were getting the ball to their playmakers. Kenny Pickett had his best passing day of the year, 278 yards, I believe the total number was. Najee Harris, nearly 100 rushing yards. Pat Freiermuth is back. The Muth got loose for over 100 receiving yards this past week. Yes, the points are not there necessarily, but you figure in Deontay Johnson's going to get his. George Pickens had a couple of big plays in the passing game. Maybe now, Florio, we can start to buy into the Steelers' offense a little bit more.
Yeah, I don't think we're ever going to be bullish on Kenny Pickett or anything like that, but it at least makes Pickens and Deontay startable. Deontay had a touchdown that should have been a touchdown yesterday go through his hands. Najee and Warren looked better. I expect those running backs to go off next week against the Cardinals especially.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting. Does that count as a James Conner revenge game against the Steelers?
It should. Right?
It's a James Conner revenge game next week. We'll talk about that, though, later on in the week. In the meantime, we got plenty more to talk about. We'll go through some of the highs and lows of Week 12. We got top performers, some disappointments, and we'll talk about some playoff schedules, some guys that you might want to keep an eye on, good or bad. That's coming up next on the NFL Fantasy Football Show. Look at the top performers for Week 12 with the Monday night game still to come. Josh Allen doing Josh Allen things, 339 passing yards, couple of touchdowns, 81 rushing yards, and 2 more touchdowns on the ground, nearly 40 fantasy points for him. Welcome back, Kyren Williams, 143 rushing yards, another 61 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 38.4 fantasy points in his return. Tyreek Hill is still Tyreek Hill. 9 catches for $102 and a score that gives you over 25 points. Pat Fryermuth, 9 catches for 120 yards, 21 points for the Muth. By the way, to our pal Jake Seeley, air fryer, not digging it. We can't. We gotta move away from that. Blake Grupe, who was pretty much the offense for the Saints. 5 field goals, 17 points there, and the Dolphins defense taking advantage of Tim Boyle and the Jets. 7 sacks, 2 interceptions, and a touchdown, which came in the most hilarious fashion. A 99-yard pick 6 on a Hail Mary. Big day for the Dolphins defense there, 21 points. But let's talk some of the top performers, because 2 weeks in a row, Bijan is actually getting into the mix. Like, I don't want to get too excited, but maybe Arthur Smith's starting to come around to our point of view.
I hope so. Like, all right, in the first quarter yesterday, there was a 3rd and 4th down where they used Algier and Patterson. I think it was end goal over Bijan, and I was like, coaching malpractice all the way. Then he kind of fixed it. 63% of the snaps, 16 carries, 6 targets. Bijan goes for over 120 total yards. A touchdown gives you 27 fantasy points. And the thing is, like, next week they get the Jets. They should throw the ball less than 10 times against the Jets. Like, they should just run the ball nonstop. Then they get the Bucks, the Panthers, Colts, and Bears is how Bijan ends his fantasy season. So I know he hasn't been what we've wanted him to be up until this point. The last 2 weeks are very encouraging. He could still be 100% a league winner with the schedule that he has moving forward. Just needs a little bit more work, and he's been getting it as of late.
He's getting 20 or more opportunities in back-to-back games and had his biggest fantasy game of the season this past week. So hopefully Arthur Smith's starting to see it our way. That'd be great. I mentioned Kyren Williams having a huge day, and welcome back. I know the talk coming into the week was that maybe he was going to be limited. What would he have done if he were limited? He had over 200 scrimmage yards, 6 catches, a couple of touchdowns, looked great after coming back from the injury. Yeah, we saw Royce Freeman kind of get in there when Kyren needed to catch his breath a little bit, but there should be no doubt that he is the RB1 in Los Angeles, that Sean McVay is going to use him as much as possible. So, I mean, look, Darrell Henderson was released. You can move on from him. Royce Freeman, if you were somehow holding on to him, I don't see him getting a ton of opportunities. I know he had a touchdown late in that game, but that feels like that production is going to be hard to buy into. Kyren Williams is back, and you can start him with any level of confidence. Also, maybe we don't listen to Sean McVay when he says guys are limited at this point. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Calvin Ridley. Look, maybe the Zay Jones things are true, right? That maybe when Zay Jones is there, maybe Calvin Ridley is a thing, because it's another week where he picked it up and played well.
I will fully admit I was kind of skeptical on that narrative. I used it as a reason in my Start 'em Sit 'em article. I'm not going to say I didn't, but I was like, is it really all due to Zay Jones? But now there's 5 games with Zay Jones. 24.1, 5.2 fantasy points, 20.6, 30.1, 21.9. At some point, it's like, okay, he's top 20 in 4 of those 5 games. Maybe there is something to this. But he had 0 at halftime and then exploded in the second half. And that's why I was so excited for Calvin Ridley coming into the year. He could put up points so quickly in chunks, so as a downfield threat, as a red zone threat. It's starting to come together for him, for this Jaguars passing attack. Don't look at the schedule too much ahead. Like, next week is a favorable matchup against the Bengals. But then it's Browns, Ravens. Bucks is a very good matchup. Panthers is a very good matchup. So 2 hard ones, then 2 very easy ones to end the fantasy season. But Calvin Ridley maybe could make up for his early season struggles and kind of push people over the top.
Very well could. And I was worried. I told somebody to start Ridley, and I was very nervous in the first half. And in the second half, I felt a little bit better about that decision. Along with Calvin Ridley, though, his quarterback is starting to get hot, too. Trevor Lawrence has had 2 of his better games back-to-back. I don't think it's a coincidence that some of it has had to do with some of his rushing production. He is running the football, had a rushing score this past week, had a couple of rushing touchdowns the week before. Look, he's not going to be confused with Jalen Hurts or Lamar Jackson or anybody like that, but he can do just enough. He's a big body quarterback. You see there him stretching the ball out over the goal line. he can do enough with his legs that he gives you some of those extra points. And then, as you mentioned, getting Calvin Ridley involved. It was a decent Evan Ingram game. Christian Kirk's having another great year. Just starting to kind of get hot. And I don't know, maybe this is a Trevor Lawrence thing where the back half of the season things come together, because it looks like it's starting to happen for the second year in a row. But now all that narrative, all that excitement we had about Trevor Lawrence coming into the season, looks like it's actually starting to come to fruition there. So that's great. On the other side of that game, the Texans-Jaguars, it was a really fun game. Jacksonville hangs on to get the win by the slimmest of margins. A Matt Amendola field goal doinks off the crossbar, another foot or so, and the Texans probably win that game. But nonetheless, another good week for the Houston Texans receivers.
Amendola is kind of like the Tim Boyle of kickers, where I'm like, if you can't make a 50-yarder, why are you in the NFL? But he almost made a 58-yarder. I'll give him credit for that. Yeah, the Texans wide receivers are just must-start options each and every week. Like, they have a tough matchup next week. I don't care. CJ Stroud is rewriting every single week. You could pick a new stat that he has just completely shattered the rookie record in. He should be an MVP candidate 100%. Tank Dell, 5 or more catches, 50 or more yards, and a touchdown in 4 straight games. The only other player to do that this year is Tyreek Hill. Nico Collins is showing us that he has such a high ceiling. When Noah Brown returns, he has a high ceiling. Dalton Schultz, start all of your Texans pass catchers. Start Devin Singletary. This is one of the best offenses in football. I don't care that it's very young and there's rookies and all of that. They're getting it done each and every week. You need to play them all in fantasy.
Yeah, at this point, I don't know that you have an excuse to not play Dell or Collins. Which means I know I'm going to get a whole bunch of tweets this week. Should I play Tank Dell or, I don't know, who's your Tyreek Hill? Play them both. I don't know. Figure it out. Rashee Rice. We've been waiting for Rashee Rice to have a big game, and he's been on the verge, it felt like, for a number of weeks, and it finally happened on Sunday against the Raiders. Season high in catches, season high in receiving yards, had a touchdown as well. We have all sort of admitted for the last few weeks that he is the wide receiver 1 in Kansas City. Not the number 1 pass catcher. That's always going to be Travis Kelce. But he's the wide receiver 1 there, and it's starting to pop a little bit. And really for the Chiefs, couldn't come at a better time, as they are right now still the 2 seed in the AFC, trying to get that number 1 seed and have everything go through Arrowhead. But nonetheless, they need their wide receivers to step up and make plays, and it looks like Rashee Rice is doing it. And you can feel a little bit more confident about him for the rest of the season, having him in your starting lineup, because that was sort of the thing that I think we were worried about. It was a thing where, he was playing well enough for us to consider putting him in the lineup, but not well enough that you felt super confident about it. Maybe now we can have a little bit more confidence about it.
Starting to get more routes, snaps, targets, everything. And they need him to step up, and he is.
He is absolutely stepping up when they need him the most. Those are the guys who we were happy with. Now the guys that we were unhappy with. Jaylen Warren. It was supposed to be a Jaylen Warren week, and it turned out to be a Najee Harris week. Huh?
Yeah, first game with the new OC there for Pittsburgh, and Pickett goes on to have a season high in passing yards. Najee has a season high in rushing yards. They snapped their horrendous 58-game streak without 400 yards, but it didn't lead to a lot of production for Jaylen Warren, and that was a little bit disappointing, because this was a game that the game script was there for him to have a big game. It was a close game throughout. He got a lot of volume, but I think you should feel better about the usage than the stats show there. They split snaps, pretty much, him and Najee Harris. They split carries, and Warren was the one getting used more in the passing game. So while Harris had more yardage and had the touchdown there, I don't think a whole lot has changed in this backfield. They're almost a pointing Spider-Man gif. And I would actually rather have Jaylen Warren than Najee Harris, because he's getting the passing down work and he is the more explosive option. But next week they get the Cardinals. It's a get-right spot for both of them. You're starting both of them, especially with 6 teams on bye. So it was a disappointing week for Jaylen Warren, but just breathe. There's better days ahead.
Yeah, I think there are better days coming. And I do think it may end up alternating between who has the big weeks back and forth. That'll be frustrating, but at least both of them seem to be relatively productive, so that's a plus. Saquon was a disappointment this week, and that game was not fun to watch. We didn't think that game was going to be fun to watch between the Giants and the Patriots, and it was not fun to watch. But I did think we would get more than the 6.2 points that we got out of Saquon this week, because we saw the week before, Tommy DeVito realized that he's got to get him involved. They were giving him targets. He had touchdowns. This week, it was DeVito taking shots downfield and giving us a fun little celebration and all this kind of stuff. And so Saquon didn't get to participate in any reindeer games. He's still Saquon. Yeah, I mean, we got the
coolest celebration in football.
This is it. This is the thing now. Thanks to Tommy DeVito. Look, Saquon is such, the ceiling is so high that you're never going to not start Saquon. But hopefully he starts getting involved more the rest of the way.
Yeah, I think that's kind of who he is now with Tommy DeVito, a very high ceiling but very low floor kind of player, because these are the games the Giants are going to play most weeks, where like they get a touchdown or two, and if it doesn't go to Saquon, you're probably like going to be a little disappointed in fantasy.
Yeah. It's weird to think that the Giants and Chargers have the exact same number of wins when those two teams have very different outlooks coming into the season. But here we are.
The Chargers quarterbacks he's not throwing the hands up.
He's not throwing the hands up. He's throwing up the hand with a splint on it, maybe, something like that. That's about it. We are just a few weeks away from the start of the fantasy playoffs in most leagues. In a lot of leagues, weeks 15 through 17 are the postseason. So that means you got basically 2 weeks left to kind of get yourself right and get yourself into the playoffs if you were sitting on the bubbles. We're looking at a couple of guys, one with a good schedule, one with a bad schedule. Who do you like down the stretch, or who do you like, I guess, into the playoffs for fantasy?
Dak Prescott. Not only has he been the hottest quarterback walking the planet, since week 6, he has one game with fewer than 24 fantasy points, and he has 28 or more in every game but one since week 8. Like, he's been red hot. But look at his fantasy playoff schedule. Buffalo, Miami, Detroit. Not only are those 3 favorable matchups that you can put up passing game numbers against them, they all have an offense on the other side that will be able to put up points against the Cowboys, even with their stout defense. Like, Dak is going to have to throw, going to have to put up numbers, because the other side will be putting up numbers. He's an MVP candidate. I don't want to hear who is he beating. He's going to beat some of those teams in that stretch and be an MVP candidate and probably win a whole bunch of fantasy titles during that run.
Man, the MVP conversation is such a moving target, but Dak is very much in it. I'm going to go with a guy in his same division at the running back spot, DeAndre Swift. And it's really frustrating if you have DeAndre Swift, because sometimes the Eagles just stop going to him. And then they give him the ball a couple times in a row, and he breaks off a couple long runs, or he's a nice catch and run, and you're like, why don't they give this guy the ball more? We saw it a little bit yesterday, too, against the Bills, where he had a couple of really nice plays and really helped move the ball for the Eagles. You look down the stretch, 15, 16, 17. You got the Seahawks, the Giants, and the Cardinals. Those are 3 really peak matchups. And, look, I don't know how the Eagles are going to play things. They are going to lock up a playoff spot really soon if they haven't already. Whether or not they have the 1 seed locked up, that remains to be seen. They've got a tough one with the 49ers this week. That'll go a long way toward determining that. And even then, I don't know if Nick Sirianni is just going to suddenly sit all of his guys. But DeAndre Swift has a really great opportunity in those final weeks of the fantasy season to make some big plays for you. On the other side, who has a schedule that you're not so thrilled about?
James Conner. James Conner hasn't been playing good football as of late, and it's not really on him, but him and Kyler Murray both returned week 10. Conner has less than 9 fantasy points in all 3 games. He's not being utilized in the passing game. All the goal line opportunities are going to Kyler or Clayton Tune, but then look at this schedule that he has in the playoffs. The 49ers in week 15, the Bears in week 16, and the Eagles in week 17. We know the Niners and the Eagles are the hardest matchup for a running back. Don't tell the Bills that. They kept trying to run up the middle yesterday. The 49ers, I would say, are a top 2 or 3 toughest matchup for a running back. The Bears might look like an easy one. They've allowed the fewest rushing yards to running backs since like week 7, I believe it is. The only struggle against pass catching running backs, James Conner, since he's returned, has 6 receiving yards. So I think Conner might just be a player that you bench for the duration of the fantasy playoffs if you have the option to do so.
Yeah, and that stinks because he was so good early in the season. He's been such a key part, I think, of a lot of fantasy teams. A solid RB2 for a lot of teams, and it's going to be tough sledding in the playoffs. Scary Terry has been scaring a lot of defenses recently, but I'm a little bit scared of having him in my lineup in the fantasy playoffs. He's got the Rams, the Giants, and the 49ers. I know we look at the Giants, we're like, oh, it's the Giants. But against the pass, they've been very good. We know how good the 49ers are. The Rams have a young secondary, but they have found ways to kind of put the clamps on some wide receivers. Throw in the fact that Sam Howell has spread the ball around. Yeah, McLaurin is the number one receiver, at least on paper, but we've seen Jahan Dotson get involved. We've seen some Curtis Samuel games. They're getting so many different guys involved. Brian Robinson's had big receiving games. Antonio Gibson's going to catch the football. There's no one place that they're going to go with the ball, and that alone makes it a little bit nervous time. Then you throw in the matchups, and get it. It's hard to get away from Terry McLaurin, but I don't love what the outlook is going to be for him throughout the fantasy playoffs. It seems like a little bit of a scary situation for Scary Terry. It's been frustrating for McLaurin this year.
Yeah, like his quarterback's leading the league in yards, and it's just been an up and down type of year for him. Frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely frustrating as well. We are not done yet, of course. We still got the waiver wire. We got Matt Okada. He's going to stop by and give us some of the guys that you should be picking up off the waiver wire because, look, the trade deadline may have passed in your league, but that doesn't mean you still can't make some moves to help bolster your roster with the regular season winding down in fantasy football. So we'll come back, talk about the waiver wire, let you know who you should be maybe going to get for the next couple of weeks. That's coming up next on the NFL Fantasy Football Show. It's time for the waiver wire presented by YouTube TV. Here are the list of some waiver wire targets put together by our friend Matt Okada. At quarterback, Derek Carr. Just hope he doesn't get inside the red zone, but that's a different story. Russell Wilson, who is playing some really good football right now. Jordan Love, who has stepped up his game. Baker Mayfield, who has kept Mike Evans afloat as well. Running back, Chuba Hubbard. Zach Moss. Yeah, Zach Moss still hanging around. Keaton Mitchell, Ty Chandler. Just a note that both Mitchell and Chandler are on a bye this week, but worth stashing. Tyjae Spears in Tennessee. Ezekiel Elliott, maybe worth a stash there in New England. Wide receiver, Jaden Reed, Curtis Samuel, Greg Dortch in Arizona. Jackson Smith and Jigba playing better in Seattle. Jalen Hyatt, Khalil Shakir also in play. Pat Freiermuth at the tight end spot, and Isaiah Likely, especially with Mark Andrews out for the rest of the season. Time to welcome in our pal Matt Okada, who writes the waiver wire column. You can find it every week at NFL.com/waiver wire. One thing I want to correct, though, before we dive into this. I said that part of the schedule for Terry McLaurin had the Giants. I meant the Jets as the other New York team. If you were watching the video show, then that was correct on the screen. It was me that fouled it up. So apologies on that one. All right, Matt, let's get into this one because coming up in week 13, it is one last Bye-Mageddon, which is great just before the fantasy playoffs hit. We've got the Ravens, the Bills, the Bears, the Raiders, the Vikings, and the Giants. 6 teams out, a lot of key pieces out, so a lot of people will need waiver wire help. So let's start at quarterback. Derek Carr has basically been Derek Carr this year, which is to say it's not awful, but it's not great. But in a pinch with 6 teams on a bye, I would imagine, Matt, a lot of folks will need a guy like Derek Carr.
Yeah, that's pretty much the perfect summary, Marcus. He's been a kind of a low ceiling streamer option who's somewhat consistent, kind of like a Baker Mayfield a little bit. But we are all in trouble between injuries and buys these days, so I think Carr is in play. Here's my take. He's hit 300-plus passing yards in 4 of his last 5 games, and he's thrown multiple touchdowns 3 times since week 5, but for some reason he's only managed to put those marks together once, and that was in week 8 against the Colts, and he scored 18 fantasy points and was a great fantasy option. I think he can do that again in week 13 against the Lions, so if you're streaming through this Bye-Mageddon, I think he's a play. Over their last 5 games, Detroit's defense has given up 23 fantasy points per game to QBs, and that includes a 4-point stinker by Jimmy Garoppolo, bringing the numbers down. They all, besides Garoppolo, hit 21-plus points, and Jordan Love posted 27 on Thanksgiving. So I think Carr is absolutely in play. I definitely feel better if Chris Olave clears the concussion protocol, so keep an eye on that because losing his best weapon would not help with that ceiling. But I do believe he's a borderline QB1, and he's got a couple other good matchups down the stretch, too, if you need a combo stream.
Yeah, he could help you in the bye week, but no one's going to get you more hype than Jameis Winston. I mean, you saw him rapping along to Ludacris on the sideline. But a lot of people are going to need quarterbacks, Okada, and Russell Wilson not only getting it done with his arm, running a little bit more as well.
He is. He's also not going to give you as much hype as Jameis Winston or Ludacris because he's not that exciting either. But here's the thing. Yes, Wilson has not hit 20 fantasy points since week 4, and he's only averaging 176 passing yards per game over that span. But to your point, he has rediscovered his rushing ability in recent weeks. He's hit 30-plus yards on the ground in 5 of his last 7, and he scored with his legs on Sunday. He's also thrown 20 touchdowns on the year, which is the 5th most in the NFL. Pretty surprising. Thank you, Courtland Sutton, for a lot of that. I think in the right matchups, he can cobble the pieces together and be a fantasy starter. And oh my goodness, are the matchups coming. Here are his opponents for the rest of the season and their schedule-adjusted rank against quarterback. Texans, 25th. Chargers, 32nd. Lions, 28th. Patriots, 5th. You can skip that one. And Chargers, reminder, 32nd, again in championship week. Oh my goodness. I think you can play Russell Wilson almost the entirety of the rest of the season with that ground game ability, bringing back his floor. I think he's a viable stream.
I mean, look, I thought Russ was going to have a kind of a renaissance last season. It didn't happen. I was skeptical this year, so maybe I can just tell myself that I was a little bit early. I was just a year ahead of schedule with Russell Wilson. Carolina's a mess, Matt. They fire their head coach. Who had given up play calling duties, then took them back. Now he's gone. Who knows what's going to happen with the passing game? Bryce Young is struggling. The offensive line is bad. But there's Chuba Hubbard, who's made Miles Sanders expendable. It's not exciting, but he is the RB1, it looks like, down there for the Panthers.
Yeah, he is, and he has been now for a while, and the results have not really followed, which is kind of the disappointing part, and I don't really blame the people who dropped him all over NFL.com and otherwise fantasy leagues, but I will throw this out there to your point about Reich. We have seen coaching shakeups this year a few times in Buffalo, in Vegas, in Pittsburgh this last week. Pretty much all of them ended up being positive for the team. And it's not that hard to be positive when you start as low as the Panthers have set the bar. They have been utterly just atrocious on offense, really entirely. And so I think the bar can only go up from here. And we can also look at week 12 for a glimmer of hope from Hubbard. He got involved in the passing game big time. 45-plus yards both on the ground and through the air, and he scored a touchdown and top 20 fantasy points in total. And yes, Miles Sanders did get 16 opportunities of his own, but he was abysmal on those opportunities, 28 yards on all 16 chances put together. Hubbard continued to show his superior efficiency. He flashed that passing game upside that we heard Carolina wanted from Sanders coming into the season. So I think Hubbard is the guy that they wanted from the beginning. I think they continue to ride him more. And if this offense can take a step forward with a little bit of a shakeup, as other teams have, I think Hubbard has big upside down the stretch.
Speaking of big upside, the fantasy Twitter community has all come on board the Keaton Mitchell hype train. And it never happens where the fantasy community swings and misses when we all get excited for a prospect. But it might actually be happening here for Keaton Mitchell.
Yeah, that's 100% true. Don't fact check us. And by the way, we set up with all the 3 boring guys so that Keaton Mitchell could be extra exciting here. So that was you got through all of that slog to get to this. He is electric. And imagine this, Ravens. You give him 11 touches on Sunday Night Football. He gives you 89 yards. And what Keaton Mitchell is, in my opinion, the latest piece of evidence to support a proposition that I have. Listen up, Roger and all the team owners. NFL coaching staff should hire fantasy analysts as talent spotters because we all seem to know who the best players are while the coaches seem to struggle to figure it out. We knew Mitchell was the best back on the team weeks ago. It feels like Harbaugh and Monken maybe are now figuring it out. If they're watching the same tape I am and you guys are, Mitchell should get 15-plus opportunities a game moving forward. And if he does in this offense with his explosiveness, that is legitimately top 5 fantasy running back potential. You must roster him even heading into their bye, and I think he'll be a viable start coming out of it against the Rams while we see what happens with his touches, and then could be an auto start rest of season.
Yeah, I mean, he has looked really good. Just a big play waiting to happen there in Baltimore. Meanwhile, in Green Bay, they've got a group of really young wide receivers who are all sort of battling for opportunity and attention. But it seems, Matt, like Jaden Reed is the guy who really is standing out amongst that group. And if there's a Packer receiver to have, it looks right now like Reed seems to be the guy.
Yeah, I agree. It would be nicer if those 5 or 6 other guys weren't around taking bits and pieces here and there, because I think Jaden Reed would be a stud if that wasn't the case. But I do believe, like you're saying, he is stepping above the pack, no pun intended. And he made the waiver column and the podcast segment and my Thanksgiving preview article last week, and he came through on Thanksgiving with 15 fantasy points against the Lions. That's a touchdown and 15 plus in each of his last 3 games, and he's averaging 75 scrimmage yards per game over that span. And once again, he was right in the mix with Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs in routes run on Thursday and led the team with 8 targets. Plus, he's still involved in the run game, which is a nice wrinkle. It gives him a couple extra fantasy points. Every once in a while, it brings him an extra touchdown. I think we have yet to see the true upside he could reach if the Packers feature him more. Shout out my fantasy talent spotter idea. But even if his role stays par for the course, he is a viable flex play who should absolutely be rostered. And if they do start making him more of a consistent number 1, he could be a league winner.
Speaking of potentially could be a league winner, one game for the Pittsburgh Steelers with a new play caller. Pat Freiermuth goes out and puts up a career high in yards. What are we making of this?
Yeah. We all thought maybe this was going to be George Pickens or Jalen Warren breakout. In fact, it was Pat frickin' Freiermuth breakout. And once again, we all drafted him in fantasy as a top 10 tight end back in the summer, and he did absolutely nothing in Matt Canada's offense all year. And then one game into the post-Canada era, their first game with 400 yards in what was it, like 4 years, he led the team with 11 targets, 9 catches, 120 yards. It was the most catches any Steeler has posted in a game all year, and it turned into 21 fantasy points, which is tops at the position as we speak right now. I don't think we can expect this kind of production every week of this new era, but even half of that production would be startable in fantasy. And once he adds some touchdowns down the stretch, I think he is a locked and loaded starter. If this offense stays as it looked this past week, you have to add him. Even if you are okay at tight end, stash him away to steal him from other managers in your league or as a backup.
Seems like tight ends are the flavor of the week in the AFC North. Unfortunately, we lost Mark Andrews for the rest of the season. A lot of people loved Isaiah Likely last year. And look, I know he didn't have a great game necessarily on Sunday night, but he's a guy who's going to get targets, and that's pretty much all you need from a tight end, right?
Yeah, I'm surprised that Likely was not more heavily added last week following the season-ending injury to Mark Andrews and what we saw from Likely last year when Andrews was out. He's currently sitting at 16% rostership on NFL.com, and I don't know how much that number will jump after he caught 4 balls for 40 yards and 8 fantasy points on Sunday Night Football, which is all respectable but not super exciting. Here's the thing. Lamar Jackson completed just 18 passes for 177 yards on Sunday, looking kind of shaky against an uncharacteristically competent Chargers defense. And even with that reduced production, Likely led the team in receiving yards and was second in targets to Zay Flowers. If 8 points is the floor, that's a pretty respectable floor for a fantasy tight end. And when Lamar gets going again, which he has, and when this Ravens offense starts scoring again, which they will, 2 touchdowns last night, is incredibly odd for them. Likely has huge upside. I put him in a similar tier to Freiermuth where you really need to add him even going into his bye, and then we'll see how much he starts down the stretch.
Yeah, we're always happy to have tight ends who can be even mildly productive, and Isaiah Likely fits into that category. Matt Okada, you can follow him on Twitter at Matt Okada. Check out the article at NFL.com/waiverwire. Matt, thank you as always. We'll talk to you next week. As for the rest of you out there, that is it. We are done. We appreciate you hanging out with the NFL Fantasy Football Show presented by Subway. You know the drill. Tell 2 friends to tell 2 friends. Rate, review, and remember, the biggest lie you can tell yourself is, I don't need to write that down. I'll remember it. Be safe, take care of yourselves, enjoy the week, and we will talk to you again real soon.